The bells of Basilica Gloriana do not ring for comfort, they count. Each iron note corresponds to a ledger entry, matched to a toe tag, married to ritual protocol. On Shrine World Glavia, the mortuary bells have tolled without pause for 17 days, their bronze voices marking the faithful as they pass from the Emperor's service to the Emperor's rest. Mourning tallies run high in siege years. Today they crest and refuse to fall. Ash drifts across the precinct like slow grey weather, and in the audit chamber a servitor turns its click wheel as the sun rises again, precise as hunger. Scribe Auditor Kellen moves through the corpse processing sanctum with a clerk's practiced economy: ink, seals, auspex slate. His morning inspection follows the same route through marble corridors that descend into the industrial devotion of the sacred crematoriums. Here, the dead arrive from Glavia's hive, sprawl in pallet stacks, their bodies organized by parchment catechisms and civic duty. Line 23 Lambda handles the overflow, a blessed conveyor system 100 meters long, linking intake gutters to the mouths of the crematoria. Servo claws lift, sort, and feed with mechanical precision. Every motion represents liturgy hammered into steel, every cycle sanctified by repetition. The air hangs thick with Formula 9 mores, the sacred incense blend designed to mask decay while preparing flesh for its return to the Emperor's light. Kellen notes the mixture's consistency in his ledger, though the amber smoke seems thinner than regulation standards demand. The sensor master mutters dosage figures, his voice hiding a tremor. Supplies have been reduced since the fleet demanded refinery tithe. Austerity measures have cut promethium allocations by 28% this quarter, forcing compromises throughout the processing chain. The incense smells correct but dissipates too quickly, a variance Kellen documents because a scribe cannot rely on his nose, he must measure with numbers. From vox grills mounted throughout the sanctum, Confessor Ven's voice flows in measured warmth, delivering the morning sermon to Glavia's faithful millions. "We endure through community, brothers and sisters," he intones, quoting the catechism of shared breath that has soothed riots and famines across the sector. "We breathe as one in the Emperor's grace, we face death together, and together we transcend it." Workers in stained aprons bow their heads without ceasing their labor. Kellen observes the effect on cycle time. Faith functions as a regulator here, slowing panic the way a valve controls steam pressure. At Station 7, Corpus Tender, Malik, guides corpses through the blessing rite, his voice joining the mechanical rhythm of conveyor gears. "Emperor's peace upon your flesh, Emperor's light upon your soul." The litany continues without variation, each word sanctified by repetition. They process a pilgrim, small and wrapped in travel shroud, bearing the dust of long roads. Malik traces sacred oil on the brow, recites the names that release the body from civic duty, and Kellen nods for the blessing rite to proceed before reduction. The shroud jumps, not from wind or mechanical vibration, but from movement within. Fingers push against linen, seeking air that lungs no longer process. The corpse that had been Pilgrim Jorik of Hablock Tertius sits upright with sudden coordination, milky eyes focusing on Malik's throat with unmistakable hunger. The attendant starts to speak the next line of the rite and loses it to a strangled sound. Protocol calls for restraint, not drama. Malik retreats to the blessed Prometheum reserves, while Kellen marks timestamps and temperature readings from the last pass through the reduction chamber. The reanimation spreads along line 23 Lambda with systematic precision. Other corpses begin to stir, their movements synchronized by some unspoken imperative that transcends individual consciousness. This represents no supernatural anomaly whispered about on distant, warp-cursed worlds. In the 41st millennium, zombie plagues manifest as recurring systems failure, the brutal intersection of overstretched war logistics, desperate devotional practices, and warp-tainted biology exploiting institutional vulnerabilities. Kellen activates his Voxcaster with practiced calm. Processing Station 7 to command, requesting immediate implementation of Pallid Dawn protocols. The words feel strange in his mouth, drawn from memorized emergency procedures he never expected to invoke. Pallid Dawn, the ancient quarantine directive that can seal entire sectors, suspend civilian authority, and authorize orbital sterilization if contamination spreads beyond containment. Negative, Auditor Kellen, comes the bureaucratic response. Pallid Dawn requires inquisitorial authorization or Lord Marshal approval, file standard contamination report through proper channels. The reply feels surreal as more corpses animate around him, creating a grotesque parody of the morning's sacred routine. In the supervisor's office, beneath a faded triptych of saints and a ventilation duct that hisses like a leaking lung, Kellen breaks a red wax seal and examines the Pallid Dawn memorandum. The document predates anyone in the facility, outlining sterilization litanies and orbital bombardment as if they were simple inventory procedures. Invocation requires 3 signatures and 1 admission of failure, that the city cannot be saved intact. Inquisitorial writ, Lord Marshal authority, bishopric assent. He sets it down without comment, understanding that such authorization requires navigating bureaucratic strata that consume days in devotions to procedure. The morning's quota demands processing 400 corpses before shift change. Line 23, Lambda operates at 117% capacity to meet off-world tithe obligations, its blessed machinery pushed beyond sacred specifications by economic necessity. Guildmaster, Olin's reports consistently show temperature curves within acceptable variance, though Kellen has documented irregularities in the denaturing protocols that suggest corners being cut to maintain impossible schedules. Now those compromises reveal their cost. Corpses that should have been rendered harmless by blessed heat and sacred chemistry rise from their conveyor beds with flesh intact enough to house whatever malevolent force animates them. A medici probator arrives without escort, mask fogged from the climb, delivering blood chemistry sheets Kellen requested. Stage markers do not align with fever charts. The lull phase resembles grace rather than pathology. When asked about fuel allocation, the probator responds with tired eyes. Promethium deliveries met only 42% of schedule, with front-line requirements taking priority. Even saints kneel to logistics. The crematorium chimneys struggle against rationed fuel supplies, their flames guttering low precisely when maximum purification becomes essential. Workers continue feeding pallets into the system, their movements displaying the exhaustion of machinery pushed beyond design limits. Another corpse twitches, caught by restraint clamps before it can raise its head. The deacon's censer runs low, smoke forming pale bands around throats that seek to speak without breath. Through the clear-story windows, the chimneys of Basilica Gloriana stutter on insufficient promethium, their sacred flames failing just as the bells resume their grim arithmetic. The iron voices continue counting the faithful dead with mechanical precision, but in the depths of the corpse processing sanctum, some numbers require calculation twice, once for the dead and once again for what the dead have become. The medici probator's blood chemistry sheets spread across Kellen's inspection table tell a story that extends far beyond Glavia's processing sanctums. Each marker, each cellular signature, matches patterns documented in 17 sectors where similar outbreaks have carved through Imperial populations with methodical precision. What shambles along line 23 Lambda represents not isolated corruption, but a family of necrobiological contagions that exploit the fundamental architecture of Imperial civilization. These are Nurgle's gifts, and they follow rules as rigid as any Imperial doctrine. The pathogen taxonomy begins with classical plague zombies, animated corpses driven by profane litanies that pervert the sacred relationship between flesh and spirit. These walkers retain fragments of muscle memory and social recognition, making them devastatingly effective at infiltrating communities that mistake familiar faces for salvation. They favor density and noise, rising in morgues, processions, and battlefield mass graves before moving toward warmth and carbon dioxide with brutal purpose. The pathogen functions as both biological agent and ritual component, requiring specific combinations of decay, despair, and communal exposure to achieve full virulence. More insidious are the poxwalkers, trapped in euphoric decay cycles that mask horror behind narcotic bliss. The pathogen hijacks neurochemical reward pathways, flooding victims with endorphins and dopamine as their flesh putrefies. These unfortunates experience unprecedented contentment during final stages, embracing decomposition as transcendent experience while actively resisting treatment and seeking to share their blessing with loved ones. Their bodies bloat and weep, yet they move with grotesque, almost joyful abandon, driven by the very diseases that consume them. The most dangerous variants are warp-tinged pathogens that corrupt the social contract with death itself. These contagions target cultural practices surrounding mortality, transforming funeral rites into transmission vectors and grief into pathological obsession. Communities develop cargo cult behaviors, maintaining elaborate death rituals that unknowingly cultivate optimal conditions for pathogen persistence. The infected dead become objects of veneration rather than sources of contamination, protected by religious taboos that prevent proper disposal. Against these threats, the pathology ladder remains grimly consistent across all documented outbreaks. Stage laddering begins with contact through fine aerosols exhaled in crowded devotionals, condensation dripping from sump ducts, or contaminated organics entering kitchens and corpse processing facilities. It presents as pilgrim's cold, mild fever, joint ache, respiratory congestion that responds to standard treatment and feels authentically benign. Nothing dramatic, which is precisely the point. Medicaid facilities routinely discharge stage 1 patients with benedictions and basic stims, unknowingly seeding communities with carriers who feel genuinely recovered. Stage 2 follows with the treacherous blessed lull, where all symptoms recede completely, while tissues undergo microscopic restructuring that prepares cellular architecture for eventual reanimation. Victims experience authentic relief, often reporting improved energy and mental clarity that families interpret as divine grace. Blood chemistry normalizes, vital signs stabilize, and communities resume normal activities while the pathogen establishes deeper systemic integration. This false recovery can persist for days or weeks, during which carriers remain highly contagious while displaying no external signs of illness. The pathogen uses this period to rewrite cellular programming and establish neurological pathways necessary for post-mortem animation. Stage 3 arrives without warning through rapid cardiorespiratory collapse that overwhelms even prepared medical facilities. The pathogen triggers coordinated cellular death, shutting down biological functions with mechanical precision. Death occurs within hours of symptom onset, leaving families and medical staff stunned by the rapid transition from apparent health to corpse. The timing ensures maximum psychological impact, transforming hope into horror while positioning fresh corpses in optimal locations for subsequent reanimation. Stage 4 begins within hours of clinical death as neural pathways established during the blessed lull activate to reanimate corpses with disturbing coordination. These zombies display herd behavior without requiring formal command structure, responding to chemical signals and electromagnetic patterns that create spontaneous organization. They move with purpose rather than random hunger, seeking specific targets that maximize transmission potential while avoiding areas treated with proper purification protocols. There is no general issuing orders, only pattern, tightening spirals around sound sources, crowding at heat differentials, directional bias along drafts and corridor geometry. Imperial countermeasures evolved to maintain order rather than counter microbes, though some accidentally intersect the biology through hard learning and institutional memory. Formula 9, Mors, when compounded in purity, does more than sanctify air or mask decay. Its resin base and phenolic oils suppress odor signatures that trigger pursuit response in Stage 3 and IV walkers, while its heat and particulate load shift convection plumes upward, buying precious seconds in corridor engagements. But the blend demands precision. Dilution for economy turns incense into smoke and smoke into a carrier of thermal currents that can lift contaminated aerosols over cordon lines. The sensor's swing matters, too fast creates vortices that roll aerosols to shoulder height. Too slow allows smoke to stratify, hiding the living by scent while marking them by silhouette. Corpse starch denaturing protocols offer harder certainty when properly executed. Flesh rendered to starch must pass through regulated heat curves with verified dwell times. At 68 to 72 degrees for sufficient minutes, most pathogen structures warp, clump, and die. At lower curves, proteins fold partially, preserving enough framework for reanimation if warp influence seeds the matrix. The machinery knows none of this. It obeys orders and input energy. Under ration, furnaces cycle shorter, conveyors accelerate to meet tithe, and temperature logs can be made to lie with well-chosen sampling windows. The pathogen needs no conspiracy, only variance and time. The theological paradox embedded in Nurgle's biological warfare demonstrates profound understanding of imperial psychology. The pathogen rewards exactly those virtues the ecclesiarchy promotes: community solidarity, care for the sick, respect for the dead, and faith in collective endurance. Families that abandon infected members show higher survival rates than those that provide loving care. Communities that maintain social isolation fare better than those that gather for mutual support. In a galaxy defined by suffering, Nurgle offers perverse comfort, a release from pain, and twisted community in shared affliction. His diseases bring false comfort that can be misinterpreted as divine grace, making the faithful vulnerable to the very force that seeks to consume them. Kellen's ledger documents this pattern in miniature across Glavia's infected population. Stage Y scattered through pilgrim queues and hab kitchens days ago, misdiagnosed as seasonal fatigue. Stage 2 brought quiet relief, a productivity bump, and an uptick in communal meals as families celebrated recovered loved ones. Stage 3 announced itself on line 23 Lambda, where denaturing curves were reported with invariance, even as furnaces coughed for lack of promethium. Stage 4 waits for a crowd and a reason to move. The bells provide rhythm. The coming procession will provide mass. Imperial purification rites interact unpredictably with pathogen biology, sometimes providing genuine protection, while other times accelerating transmission through ritualized contact. Sacred oils and blessed unguents show variable effectiveness depending on purity and proper consecration, creating inconsistent results that undermine confidence in religious countermeasures. When austerity measures compromise containment protocols by reducing fuel allocations, diluting sacred compounds, or forcing personnel reductions, the pathogen exploits every vulnerability with systematic precision. The difference between protection and catastrophe is measured in parts per 100 and seconds per pass, and when the ledger insists that fuel goes to guns and incense to ceremony, protocols that should close loops open them instead. turning imperial efficiency into vectors for the grandfather's garden. The pathogen profiles that Kellen documents demand systematic response, yet imperial containment doctrine fragments across institutional boundaries that treat cooperation as theological heresy. When his contamination report reaches Precinct Command, it triggers bureaucratic liturgy as rigid as any religious observance, each step sanctified by millennia of precedent and jealously guarded by agencies whose normal relationship involves competitive mistrust. Adeptus Arbites Sergeant Kane receives the alert through Vox grills crackling with static from overloaded transmission arrays. His response follows protocols carved in adamantium. Physical cordons begin with shrine door seals, blessed tape marked with imperial eagles, and warning litanies. The seals carry legal weight equivalent to arrest warrants, making their breach a capital offence. Arbites squads deploy with riot suppression gear and ammunition counted in precise allotments, shotguns loaded with blessed shot that costs 3 times standard munitions but carries ecclesiastical approval for use in sacred spaces. Astra Militarum involvement begins with requisition forms processed according to theatre priority matrices that place local emergencies below frontline requirements. Colonel Voss commands the 47th Mordian Reserve, equipped with aging, lasguns and vehicles maintained through salvage and prayer. His authorization covers crowd control but explicitly excludes engagement with supernatural entities without commissariat approval. The regiment's ammunition stores run at 60% capacity, forcing tactical decisions that prioritize precision over volume when every shot must count. Ecclesiarchy response flows through Confessor Ven's pastoral authority, encompassing spiritual guidance but stopping short of temporal command during emergencies. His role involves channeling crowds through controlled penance, organizing prayer vigils that keep citizens occupied while secular authorities establish containment. The confessor's sermons emphasize duty and sacrifice, transforming quarantine from imprisonment into spiritual test. His words carry weight equal to military orders among the faithful, making ecclesiastical cooperation essential for successful operations. Administratum oversight governs resource allocation through quota systems that treat emergencies as budgetary anomalies requiring proper documentation. Blessed Prometheum deliveries have been reduced 28% this quarter due to front-line requisitions, forcing choices between crematorium operations and vehicle fuel. Medical supplies follow similar constraints, with reserves calculated for seasonal illness rather than biological warfare. The bureaucracy responds to crisis by demanding more paperwork, as if proper documentation could transform catastrophe into manageable administrative challenge. Pallid Dawn represents ultimate escalation, fleet-level sterilization authorization that can reduce entire worlds to ash. The protocol requires inquisitorial writ or Lord Marshal approval, signatures carrying authority to override planetary governors and authorize orbital bombardment of civilian populations. Implementation follows specific liturgical requirements: 3-hour notification for evacuation, blessed targeting coordinates verified by astropathic communication, and post-bombardment purification rites. The authorization process assumes rational decision-making under extreme pressure and communication networks surviving the conditions that necessitate sterilization. Escalation hierarchy demands coordination between agencies whose relationships involve institutional suspicion. Shrine door seals require minor edict, 2 arbites, priest, scribe, and reader of names. District lockdown demands prefectural writ witnessed by servo skull recording. Hive quarantine requires governor's proclamation and public fasting. Each level triggers additional bureaucratic requirements: impact assessments, resource projections, evacuation plans, consuming days in committee review while contamination spreads at biological speed. Critical pressure points emerge where institutional boundaries intersect operational reality. Door 17 Gamma carries ancient charter status dating to the age of apostasy, granting permanent exemption from lockdown during holy observances. The charter supersedes local security measures, creating legal vulnerability that cannot be sealed without ecclesiastical approval or inquisitorial override. Similar documents protect dozens of sites across Glavia, each representing accumulated privilege that modern threats exploit as entry points. The 6-hour quietus window for mandatory immolation post-mortem creates systematic vulnerability. Imperial law requires corpse processing within 6 hours of clinical death, but current crematorium capacity cannot handle normal mortality plus plague deaths within required timeframes. Bodies accumulate in holding areas where blessed preservation extends the window but cannot eliminate biological risk, creating inventory backlogs that overwhelm facilities designed for steady-state operations. Street-level tensions manifest where doctrine meets contradiction. Sergeant Kane cords Pilgrim's Way, citing regulation. 14 Moors on vector suppression. Confessor Ven arrives with reliquary bearers and produces scroll older than both men, its wax unbroken since the age of apostasy. Door 17. Gamma shall remain open during holy observance. Kane shows Lex Imperialis seal on his pauldron. Ven shows Ministorum sigil and Governor's countersignature. Both seals are law. The crowd watches like right. Incense from Ven's censer braids with exhaust from Kane's patrol carrier, while Line 23 Lambda's vents exhale with oblivious rhythm. The quietus window shrinks with every moment the door stays open. Who may close it? Arbites possess regulation. Priest holds tradition. Governor fears tithe penalties. The Inquisition is not yet here. Authority chains interlock like manacles, each tier protecting others by distributing blame while ensuring no single hand owns the fire. Bureaucratic deadlock extends beyond turf wars into contradictions embedded in imperial governance, emergency powers requiring normal procedures to invoke, creating circular dependencies that prevent rapid response, while pathogens exploit every vulnerability with systematic precision. Who can override centuries-old religious charters during emergencies becomes question exposing fundamental tension between imperial unity and institutional autonomy. What institutional conflicts arise when doctrine meets logistics reveals the deeper problem. Imperial systems designed to function despite crisis rather than because of it, creating vulnerabilities enemies exploit while defenders debate proper authority through channels that may no longer exist. The unnatural quiet of the lull provides Confessor Ven with the opening he needs to reshape narrative from medical crisis into spiritual opportunity. His evening sermon echoes through vox grills mounted throughout the quarantine zones, reaching families huddled in sealed hab blocks where ration masks hang beside devotional icons. The outbreak represents divine test, he explains, with pastoral authority earned through decades, shepherding communities through siege and famine. We breathe as one in the Emperor's grace becomes liturgical response, echoed by thousands of masked voices, transforming biological threat into theological framework that citizens can navigate through familiar ritual. Initially, Ven orders the reliquaries sealed, their sacred contents protected behind blessed barriers, while ecclesiarchy officials debate proper response to contamination. But closure breeds panic among citizens accustomed to drawing strength from proximity to holy artifacts. Parish wardens report increased domestic violence, black market expansion, and underground cults promising protection through forbidden rituals. The faithful need tangible connection to the divine, especially when death stalks familiar streets wearing familiar faces. Spiritual starvation proves more dangerous than biological risk in communities where faith functions as primary social infrastructure. guided processions emerge as compromise between safety and spiritual necessity. Venn authorizes carefully choreographed movements designed to starve fear through fellowship, limited access that maintains social cohesion while respecting containment protocols in theory. Parish wardens enforce curfew through prayer schedules rather than armed patrols, creating artificial structure where civil authority fragments. Citizens report to designated shrines for mandatory devotions, their movements tracked through attendance rolls that double as population census during emergency conditions. Economic pressure mounts as merchant guilds petition through proper channels for Pilgrim's Way reopening. Their arguments carry weight beyond spiritual considerations. Glavia's tithe economy depends entirely on pilgrimage traffic, with visiting faithful providing currency that funds everything from hab block maintenance to crematorium operations. Guild representatives present detailed projections showing economic collapse within weeks if pilgrimage routes remain closed, their ledgers quantifying piety as revenue streams. Without pilgrimage coin, Prometheum allocations will tighten further, forcing crematoriums to fail completely rather than merely struggle with current quotas. Venn faces impossible calculus between medical advice counseling isolation and economic reality demanding circulation. His solution demonstrates pastoral pragmatism shaped by decades, navigating institutional contradictions, the penitent march, routing sacred relics through traditional processional paths while trusting incense and collective faith over medical warnings. The authorization represents theological certainty, transcending mere medical advice, framing community endurance as stronger protection than individual precaution. Route planning reveals how geography intersects theology in ways that create systematic vulnerability. Traditional processional paths follow ancient pilgrimage roads carved during Glavia's founding, their sacred significance embedded in centuries of devotional practice. The march must pass beneath sump duct ventilation systems that exhale industrial breath from Line 23 Lambda's accelerated operations, where Olan's increased throughput creates aerosol plumes carrying microscopic cargo through air circulation networks predating current understanding of biological warfare. From the sump ducts, the procession continues through Door 17 Gamma, its ancient charter exemption making closure impossible during holy observances. The massive bronze portals carved with imperial eagles represent architectural theology designed to accommodate thousands during religious festivals, their exemption status creating legal sanctuary that supersedes quarantine authority. Sacred precedent transforms protection into vulnerability through institutional paralysis that cannot adapt ancient privileges to modern threats. Medicae Probator Hahn submits formal objection through proper channels, documenting specific contamination risks with clinical precision. Her report details aerosol dispersal patterns, crowd density calculations, and pathogen transmission vectors, backed by empirical evidence and understanding of the pathology ladder. The objection carries medical authority yet disappears into administratum paperwork, where emergency measures compete with normal bureaucratic processing. Forms require counter-signatures from officials attending committee meetings scheduled weeks in advance, creating procedural delays that consume time the pathogen exploits with biological efficiency. Sensor Guild stores reveal the gap between promise and capability. Blessed resin tins lie light in experienced hands, forcing Guildmaster to authorize dilution with industrial solvents that maintain visual density while reducing chemical effectiveness. Cathedral treasurers approve purchase of supplementary compounds from licensed factors whose supply chains bleed into sump gang stills, creating blessed smoke that looks proper but dissipates too quickly while stirring contaminated aerosols through movement patterns rehearsed in the transept with metronome precision. Parish wardens distribute ceremonial robes blessed by proper authority, white fabric symbolizing purity, while providing psychological armor against contamination fears. Citizens don the garments with reverent care, Understanding their participation represents loyalty to community and emperor during crisis. The robes carry sacred seals and protective verses embroidered by shrine maidens, transforming participants into visible manifestation of collective faith, preparing for ultimate test of Ven's pastoral philosophy. Drum beats begin at sunset, their rhythm echoing through quarantine zones as thousands prepare for tomorrow's march. The drums carry messages beyond musical accompaniment, timing signals for procession coordination and psychological preparation for collective action. Their sound mingles with Vox sermon broadcasts and industrial litio, breathing of crematorium operations, creating urban symphony that masks subtle changes in air circulation patterns while ash falls like snow across sacred precincts. The ash carries symbolic weight as remains of the faithful returning to bless their living community, yet potentially harbors microscopic traces of pathogen that survive denaturing protocols compromised by throughput pressures. Citizens interpret the precipitation as divine blessing, opening masks to taste what they believe represents sanctified dust while inhaling particles that may carry death in forms too small to see. 10,000 white-robed figures move through streets beneath falling ash. As Ven observes from Basilica Gloriana's highest tower, his faith remaining genuine despite systematic failures converging toward catastrophic intersection. What happens when the procession route intersects? Contamination vectors becomes question whose answer will determine whether faith functions as shield or amplifier for biological warfare designed to exploit exactly the virtues imperial doctrine promotes. How collective faith responds to collective horror awaits tomorrow's test, when devotion may discover whether community endurance can overcome what community gathering has unwittingly cultivated through institutional momentum that transforms blessing into plague vector. The drumbeats that herald tomorrow's penitent march echo through chancery chambers where legal scholars convene in emergency session, their debate centering on parchment older than most imperial worlds. Door 17 Gamma's charter bears seals from the age of apostasy, its vellum surface marked with signatures whose names appear in canonical litanies. The document grants perpetual pilgrimage access during any sacred observance, language crafted during Cardinal Bucaras's reforms when ecclesiarchy authority required constitutional protection against secular interference through divine mandate rather than administrative convenience. Arbeit's Sergeant Kane presents Regulation 14 Moors Vector Suppression Authority permitting closure of transit points under Biohazard Edict. Across the marble table, Canon Jurist Maven produces the original charter seal, its wax dark as old blood, citing Lex Ministorum provisions that elevate sanctified passage to doctrinal rather than security matter. The Arbeits speak of containment through emergency powers doctrine. The ecclesiarchy speaks of continuity through theological precedent. Both appeal to the same Imperium, but different eras provide the answers. Interpretation becomes battleground where competing authorities create circular dependencies that prevent decisive action. What constitutes sacred observance? Confessor Ven's office argues that during crisis, every communal prayer qualifies. The Arbeits counter with public danger provisions allowing temporary suspension of ritual privileges when clear and present harm exists. Yet clarity depends on perspective, medical evidence versus theological certainty, immediate threat versus eternal principle. Each official cites legitimate precedent while lacking authority to override conflicting precedent, creating deadlock that consumes time while biological threats operate according to exponential rather than bureaucratic timescales. The pattern extends beyond Glavia through astropathic communications documenting similar failures across imperial space. On Vandire's Rest, ancient monastery privileges kept sacred caves open during plague outbreak, creating pathogen reservoir that reinfected surrounding settlements for decades. Shrine World Ophelia suffered catastrophic breach when pilgrimage charters prevented quarantine during Feast of Malediction, allowing infected faithful to carry contagion throughout the sector. On Viridian Prime, Water Rights Charter, granted to farming commune, guaranteed access to sacred springs even during hydrophage outbreak, their insistence on blessed waters transforming localized infection into planetary crisis. Each case study demonstrates how legal fossils from earlier ages create systematic vulnerabilities that modern enemies exploit with strategic precision. Chaos cultists study imperial law more thoroughly than imperial officials, identifying charter exemptions and ecclesiastical privileges that guarantee access during emergencies. Ancient documents written to protect faith become weapons against the faithful, their sacred language twisted into vectors for biological warfare that exploits institutional reverence for precedent over adaptation. Administrative web surrounding charter suspension reveals labyrinthine complexity designed to prevent hasty decisions while ensuring thorough review. Only inquisitorial authority can suspend religious exemptions, but requisition processing requires minimum 72-hour verification period during which astropathic communications must confirm identity, authority, and proper documentation through channels spanning multiple star systems. The process assumes stable communication networks and rational decision-making timeframes, while biological threats multiply according to cellular division rather than bureaucratic schedule. Meanwhile, Guildmaster Oland's falsified heat curve reports clear administratum review with mechanical precision, their approval stamps prioritizing tithe schedule over pathogen safety through institutional momentum that treats compliance as virtue regardless of accuracy. The reports show temperature readings within acceptable variance through selective sampling that measures furnace settings rather than flesh temperature, creating documentation that satisfies auditors while enabling systematic containment failure. Oland's deception succeeds because it aligns with institutional priorities that measure success through quota fulfillment rather than biological effectiveness, creating incentive structure that encourages fraud while punishing honesty that might disrupt production targets. Legal scribes continue debating precedent through the night, their arguments consuming hours in theological disputation while biological momentum builds toward catastrophic release. They cite cases from the Horus heresy, quote saints whose martyrdom occurred before current threats existed, and invoke principles designed for different enemies in different ages. Their scholarship demonstrates impressive erudition while missing fundamental reality. Law designed for one type of crisis may enable entirely different catastrophes when applied without adaptation to evolved threats. Ventilation systems built during Glavia's founding continue circulating air through patterns established by architects who understood devotional requirements but not biological warfare. Ancient engineering creates modern vulnerability as contaminated aerosols from Line 23 Lambda's accelerated operations disperse through circulation networks connecting processing facilities to pilgrimage routes. The building breathes with mechanical regularity, inhaling industrial exhaust and exhaling it through sacred spaces where tomorrow's faithful will gather, while legal scholars debate footnotes beneath gasping fans that carry more than dust through chambers where precedent weighs heavier than survival. Can bureaucratic inertia be overcome before biological momentum becomes unstoppable? The question hangs like ash-laden air over proceedings where law and survival demand opposite actions, revealing whether imperial institutions can adapt faster than pathogens multiply through vulnerabilities created by institutional reverence for documents that may have outlived their protective purpose. While legal scholars exhaust themselves debating ancient precedents through the night, dawn brings final preparations that transform theoretical vulnerabilities into imminent catastrophe. The Chancery arguments end without resolution, leaving door 17 Gamma open by charter default, while practical necessity forces simultaneous preparation for both containment and procession. In the Basilica's transept, vox choirs rehearse antiphons set to march cadence, their voices rising through stone corridors where condensation drips from aging ventilation grills that connect sacred and industrial spaces through architectural systems designed for devotional comfort rather than biological containment. Censer bearers prepare Formula 9 Moors supplies in the sacristy, measuring blessed resin by weight rather than scent, because guild stores run empty under increased demand. The censer guildmaster authorizes dilution to stretch sacred compounds through the full processional circuit. 2 parts blessed resin to 1 part industrial solvent decanted from refinery sweepings that carry petroleum bite. The mixture burns hot and thin, producing smoke that looks proper when first ignited but dissipates too quickly when air moves, failing to suppress odor signatures that guide infected toward concentrated gatherings. Novice bearers practice ceremonial swings under metronome rhythm, trained to build gentle vortices that should protect the faithful, but will instead fold contaminated aerosols into breathing zones. Line 23 Lambda operates at maximum throughput as Guildmaster Olin pushes blessed machinery beyond design specifications to meet impossible quotas before the sacred observance. The conveyor system runs continuously at 117% capacity, processing accumulated corpses through denaturing protocols compromised by speed and fuel rationing. Aging filtration systems struggle under increased load, their blessed mechanisms venting aerosolized particles through exhaust ports connected to circulation networks serving the entire sacred precinct. Olin schedules maintenance purges for shift change when fuel draw registers lowest and auditors pay least attention, not recognizing that purge cycles spike airflow through sump ducts crossing the processional route. Medicae staff document disturbing patterns as Stage 2 cases present with symptoms they misinterpret through theological rather than clinical frameworks. The blessed lull manifests as profound spiritual peace, patients reporting unprecedented clarity and contentment that families interpret as divine grace during crisis. Medical personnel, trained to recognize pathology through suffering rather than euphoria, classify presentations as blessed lethargy, ensuring Stage 2 patients remain integrated within community activities rather than isolated for observation. Medici Probator Hahn files urgent bulletins correlating lull onset clusters with predicted Stage 3 collapse windows, her graphs showing crisis peaks overlapping March timing, but her reports disappear into administratum queues marked for committee review scheduled after the procession concludes. Confessor Venn delivers his final sermon from the ambo, voice broadcast through Vox grills, carrying pastoral authority to every sealed hab block and quarantine chamber. He emphasizes unity through shared breath and touch, unknowingly describing optimal transmission conditions for airborne pathogens. We breathe as one in the Emperor's grace becomes more than metaphor, as he instructs the faithful to lower masks for spoken responses and embrace the gesture of peace, palms raised, then touched to chest, then extended toward neighbors. His theology of community endurance transforms biological vulnerability into spiritual strength, making faith itself into vector for contamination through rituals designed to demonstrate collective devotion. Arbite's Sergeant Kane reviews crowd control protocols in the precinct armory, his tactical briefings revealing resource constraints that compromise operational effectiveness. Ammunition stores show critical shortages, blessed shot rationed to 6 rounds per officer, standard munitions reduced to emergency reserves. His briefing emphasizes precision over volume, acknowledging that crowd suppression requires surgical rather than overwhelming response against 10,000 marchers with 30 arbites and limited ammunition. He positions teams beneath sump duct overpasses and at door 17 Gamma, where law mandates access but sense demands closure, adjusting containment diagrams to use bodies as barriers when ammunition fails. Temporal convergence reveals how separate systems intersect with mechanical precision. Procession timing, set according to liturgical calendar, coincides exactly with line 3 Lambda's shift change when ventilation cycles peak to clear accumulated industrial atmosphere. The shift change triggers automatic air circulation, drawing contaminated atmosphere from processing chambers and distributing it through sacred spaces where pilgrims gather. Sacred timing and industrial necessity converge through architectural breathing that connects devotional and utilitarian functions in ways designers never anticipated. Pilgrimage wardens distribute ceremonial masks blessed by proper authority, their filtration capability compromised by supply shortages, forcing substitution of industrial filter beads for sacred compounds. The masks provide psychological comfort while offering minimal biological protection, their blessed seals creating false confidence in protection that enables rather than prevents exposure. Sacred bells begin their morning call across Glavia's precincts, bronze voices summoning the faithful to gather for collective endurance through divine test. As their echoes fade, industrial exhausts release invisible clouds of death through ventilation systems, breathing contaminated atmosphere into spaces where thousands will demonstrate faith through proximity and shared purpose. The convergence completes itself through accumulated small failures, diluted incense, overwhelmed filtration, medical misdiagnosis, ammunition shortages, ventilation timing, each representing reasonable compromise under pressure, yet their intersection creates conditions where blessing transforms into plague vector through institutional momentum incapable of recognizing its own systematic vulnerability. How many vectors of failure can converge before containment becomes impossible? What transforms blessing into plague vector? The answers wait in the mechanical precision of systems designed to support devotion while unknowingly enabling destruction through the very virtues imperial doctrine promotes. The sacred bells fade into silence as 10,000 white-robed figures emerge from sealed hab blocks, their procession beginning under smokestack snow that falls like benediction across Glavia's ancient streets. Ash drifts through air thick with industrial breathing from line 23 Lambda's shift-change purge cycles, the timing precise and terrible. The faithful move with rehearsed devotion through pilgrimage routes carved by millennia of tradition, their voices raised in hymnal unity that echoes between stone walls while contaminated condensation settles on ceremonial masks. From the processing quarter, ventilation exhausts release invisible clouds through circulation networks that connect sacred and utilitarian spaces in ways architects never anticipated. Sensor bearers swing diluted Formula 9 Moors in practiced arcs, their thuribles producing ceremonial smoke that satisfies visual requirements while failing catastrophically at biological protection. The mixture burns bright and fast, resin cut with industrial solvents, creating impressive plumes that dissipate within seconds when air moves. Novice bearers maintain proper rhythm despite noticing the smoke's wrong behavior, trusting sacred authority over sensory evidence, while their ceremonial swings fold contaminated aerosols into breathing zones where thousands inhale in synchronized liturgical response. Beneath the sump duct overpass, condensation drips contaminated moisture onto upturned faces as pilgrims pass through shadows of blessed architecture. The droplets carry microscopic cargo from line 23 Lambda's accelerated operations, aerosolized necrospores that survived compromised denaturing protocols, now descending like unholy baptism. Airflow patterns established by shift-change ventilation create invisible currents, carrying death through breathing zones, while drums maintain processional cadence, and 10,000 voices maintain antiphonal responses that create optimal transmission conditions through synchronized exhalation. The first collapse occurs near the shrine of St. Drusilla, where traditional route narrows between ancient buttresses. Pilgrim Joric of Hablok Tertius stumbles mid-verse, his body entering stage transition from blessed lull to cardiorespiratory collapse with mechanical precision. Fellow pilgrims reach toward him with instinctive compassion, their hands touching contaminated flesh, while voices continue liturgical responses. Within minutes, he rises with coordination impossible for fresh corpse, movements guided by pathogen programming rather than conscious will. Reanimation ripples through packed crowds as the blessed lull ends simultaneously for dozens whose infection cycles synchronized through shared quarantine exposure, each collapse followed by reanimation in geometric progression that transforms devotional gathering into biological catastrophe. Arbites shotguns bark in disciplined volleys as Sergeant Kane's 30 officers engage, according to crowd control protocols never designed for this scenario. Blessed shot proves effective against reanimated flesh, but ammunition stores run critically low within minutes, 6 blessed rounds per officer vanishing into the tide, while standard munitions follow with desperate efficiency. Precision over volume, Kane breathes into his Voxcaster, already a plea against mathematics that favor mass over training. Officers fall back toward defensive positions that become killing corridors as panic drives the living into zones where the dead follow with patient hunger. Door 17 Gamma remains open despite Kane's desperate orders for emergency closure, its ancient charter superseding security authority even during catastrophic containment failure. The massive bronze portals carved with imperial eagles provide sanctuary that becomes trap, as pilgrims pour through while reanimated dead follow with single-minded purpose. Charter law prevents physical closure, while practical necessity demands immediate seal, creating legal paralysis that enables biological warfare through institutional reverence for precedent over survival. Medicae Probator Hahn attempts emergency seal of secondary access points, a medical authority theoretically superseding local security during biological crisis, but Vox channels carry conflicting commands from competing authorities. This is Probator Hahn requesting emergency seal override, she calls through hospital frequencies. The response crackles with bureaucratic absurdity. Your requisition is pending committee review. Please resubmit Form 7B Delta for expedited approval. Confessor Venn broadcasts liturgical instructions for community endurance, while Arbite's command issues tactical withdrawal orders, and administratum officials cite proper procedure for emergency authorization. The cacophony creates decision paralysis as each voice represents legitimate authority whose commands contradict others, preventing coordinated response, while biological momentum builds toward exponential spread. Promethium explosion rips through the processing district when trapped. Supply train ignites under crowd pressure, creating momentary daylight that reveals the scope of failure. The blast illuminates a wall of shambling flesh, thousands of pilgrims pressed against sealed barriers while hundreds of walking corpses advance with mechanical inevitability. Heat provides temporary barrier while consuming fuel reserves needed for crematorium operations, ensuring that even temporary success guarantees future vulnerability. Through orange glare, the dead move in silhouette ranks, their shambling coordination guided by chemical signals rather than conscious command. Confessor Venn's voice maintains calm liturgy even as his congregation transforms into horde, pastoral authority, continuing broadcast through Vox grills that carry sermons to empty hab blocks where families listen to their spiritual father, guide the faithful through transition from life to undeath. His words remain steady, quoting catechisms of endurance, while biological reality renders theology irrelevant except as soundtrack to institutional collapse. The faithful continue responding to liturgical cues even as reanimation spreads through their ranks, creating grotesque parody of communal worship where the dead maintain ritual behavior while seeking living flesh. The ancient city dies in a single night as containment barriers collapse under pressure from competing authorities, resource constraints, and systematic vulnerabilities that transformed every imperial virtue into vector for destruction. Sacred architecture becomes maze of death as pilgrimage routes channel biological warfare through population centers with maximum efficiency. By dawn, Glavia's bells toll for a city where the living hide while the dead walk freely through streets consecrated by millennia of faith. What failed first, incense purity, legal precedent, or human judgment, becomes meaningless question when systematic collapse renders sequential analysis irrelevant. Who bears responsibility when systems collapse simultaneously reveals the deeper horror, institutional design that guaranteed failure through competing authorities, resource rationing, and reverence for precedent over adaptation to threats that exploit imperial virtues as weapons against the faithful themselves. The ash settles with mathematical precision across Glavia's silent precincts, marking the end of 10,000 voices and the beginning of a different kind of accounting. 3 days after the bells fall silent, black landers descend through orbital debris fields, carrying Inquisitor Vex and his Ordo Sepulturum specialists, whose function involves dissecting failure with surgical objectivity. The ancient city smolders under lance-strike glass, but sterilization provides no understanding. Field interrogators deploy through ash-choked ruins, carrying Auspex sensors that detect pathogen traces through sacred resonance, their data servitors trailing cables like mechanical roots while recording contamination vectors with the same precision that once measured devotional attendance. The investigation maps dispersal patterns with forensic accuracy that transforms catastrophe into evidence. Auspex readings trace aerosol contamination from Line 23 Lambda's exhaust ports through sump duct circulation networks to processional routes where synchronized vulnerability gathered 10,000 faithful. Data servitors process atmospheric samples from ventilation grills, their cogitators calculating particle density and pathogen viability through circulation systems designed for devotional comfort rather than biological containment. The evidence demonstrates systematic rather than accidental exposure. Contamination flowed through architectural breathing that connected industrial and sacred spaces according to engineering patterns established during Glavia's founding, creating invisible currents that carried death with mechanical precision. Forensic analysis of recovered documentation exposes fraud through clinical examination. Guildmaster Oland's denaturing reports show temperature curves manipulated through selective sampling that measured furnace settings rather than flesh temperature, creating false documentation that satisfied auditors while enabling pathogen survival. Thermal tapes unspool their honest testimony, spalled furnace faces from hard cycling, vitreous glaze where fat burned too cool, bone ash containing intact lattice structures under microscopic examination. The reports consistently show readings within acceptable variance through creative interpretation that prioritized quota fulfillment over biological effectiveness, signed by proper authority but implemented without understanding the biological consequences of systematic shortcuts. Chemical analysis of recovered Formula 9 Mors samples reveals 40% dilution with industrial solvents that reduced efficacy below minimum sacred standards. Chromatograph readings expose the mixture's true composition, blessed resin cut with refinery sweepings that carry petroleum signatures foreign to sanctified sources. The diluted incense burned bright and fast, producing impressive visual effects while failing catastrophically at odor suppression and pathogen neutralization. Sacred compounds designed to create protective barriers became theatrical smoke that dissipated within seconds, leaving breathing zones exposed to contaminated atmosphere while providing false confidence in protection that enabled rather than prevented exposure. The reframe emerges through accumulated evidence that transforms narrative from supernatural malice to institutional complicity. Glavia's outbreak resulted not from chaos, corruption, or warp-tainted anomaly, but from systematic vulnerabilities created by austerity policies, quota pressures, and legal precedents that generated optimal conditions for catastrophic failure. Each individual decision represented reasonable compromise under pressure: fuel rationing to support frontline operations, supply dilution to stretch sacred compounds, throughput increases to meet tithe obligations, charter exemptions to preserve ancient privileges. Yet their intersection created biological warfare conditions more effective than any enemy could design, demonstrating how imperial virtues transformed into vectors through institutional momentum. Document recovery reveals signatures that distribute responsibility across institutional hierarchy, while ensuring no single authority bears complete blame. Olin's authorization of fraudulent denaturing protocols carries Guildmaster seal and Administratum counter-signature validating compliance with tithe obligations. Confessor Ven's approval of processional routes shows ecclesiarchy authority exercised according to pastoral judgment and canonical precedent, his signature accompanied by the pious notation, "Fear starves the soul." Administratum validation stamps appear on false safety reports, their bureaucratic approval demonstrating machinery functioning according to designed parameters that prioritize documentation over verification, signed by clerks whose function involves ensuring numerical conformity rather than biological safety. The investigation's central revelation exposes Imperial vulnerabilities' true nature. The plague didn't break Imperial systems cultivated the plague through design features that guaranteed systematic failure under pressure. Austerity measures created resource constraints that forced compromises in safety protocols precisely when maximum effectiveness became essential. Quota systems incentivized fraud over accuracy through metrics that measured compliance rather than results. Legal precedents prevented adaptive response to evolved threats, creating constitutional paralysis that enabled rather than prevented catastrophe. Institutional competition generated coordination failures that transformed every imperial virtue into pathogen vector through systematic inability to adapt established procedures to evolved threats. Data servitor analysis documents feedback loops that amplified rather than contained biological warfare. Economic pressure demanded increased crematorium throughput when proper denaturing required reduced speed. Fuel rationing compromised containment protocols during crisis when maximum purification became critical. Charter exemptions prevented emergency closures when containment demanded immediate seal. Each system responded to crisis by intensifying behaviors that created vulnerability rather than adapting to eliminate threats, demonstrating mechanical precision in systematic collapse. The Inquisition's ledger documents institutional pathology as precisely as biological pathology. Imperial systems infected themselves through design features that prioritized compliance over effectiveness, documentation over verification, precedent over adaptation. The pathogen exploited vulnerabilities that Imperial doctrine created through virtues transformed into vectors: community gathering, shared sacrifice, respect for tradition, faith in authority, endurance through collective action. The investigation reveals systematic rather than individual failure, institutional design that guaranteed catastrophe through the very mechanisms intended to prevent it. How does the Imperium process institutional guilt versus individual blame, becomes question exposing fundamental tension between systematic analysis and bureaucratic psychology that demands individual culpability, while systematic failures require acknowledgement that imperial design itself enabled catastrophe. What lessons can be learned when the system itself is the pathogen reveals deeper problem? Institutions designed to function despite crisis rather than because of it, creating resilience through rigidity that becomes brittleness when threats exploit structural assumptions rather than challenging them directly through conventional warfare. The forensic ledger that documents Glavia's systematic collapse extends beyond a single world's ashes. Within hours of Inquisitor Vex completing his investigation, astropathic communications arrive through the warp's tortured channels, their psychic screams carrying reports that transform isolated catastrophe into sector-wide pattern. 17 worlds across the Mordian sector broadcast identical distress signatures, outbreak confirmations that match the Ordo Sepulturum's forensic analysis with mechanical precision. Each transmission carries the same structural elements that created Glavia's failure: promethium rationing, forcing crematorium compromises, corpse processing quota increases exceeding blessed capacity, and religious festivals coinciding with industrial operations under economic pressures that transform devotional gatherings into biological targeting matrices. The pattern asserts itself through data servitor analysis that overlays transmission timestamps with pilgrimage calendars and tithe schedules. Sector-scale requisition files provide the connective tissue, revealing how separate administrative decisions created systematic vulnerability. Promethium rationing rises with frontline demand, reducing crematorium dwell times precisely when corpse throughput spikes to meet off-world starch obligations. Religious festivals align with industrial maintenance windows through centuries of established practice. The faithful gather when work pauses, while purification systems purge at shift changes to conserve fuel. The result places airflow and bodies in predictable convergence that transforms scheduled devotion into exponential transmission. Orthis Prime's manufactorum districts suffered contamination during the Festival of Sacred Labor, when worker housing concentrated personnel for communal blessing rites celebrating industrial martyrdom. The world's tithe obligations demanded production increases that pushed corpse starch processing beyond blessed capacity, forcing throughput acceleration that compromised denaturing protocols, while religious calendar required shared meals in refectory halls, breathing recycled atmosphere from processing facilities. Workers gathered in devotional unity that created optimal transmission conditions for pathogens surviving inadequate purification cycles, their industrial discipline becoming vector for systematic collapse. Skolfor's planetary defense force collapsed when garrison rotations concentrated during the trial of endurance, regimental barracks positioned downwind from crematorium exhausts operating under fuel restrictions. Military efficiency demanded scheduling precision that synchronized troop movements with sacred observances, creating predictable gathering patterns while hierarchical communication spread contamination along command chains. The PDF's final transmission lasted 6 minutes and 19 seconds before squads retreated into corridors designed as fire breaks against sabotage rather than biological threats, their disciplined response amplifying rather than containing outbreak through tactical doctrine never designed for reanimated enemies. Veridon Tertius experienced complete hive consumption when pilgrim traffic converged during the Feast of Descent, while Corpse Guild operations accelerated to clear accumulated bodies before festival crowds arrived. The hive's vertical architecture created atmospheric circulation that distributed contaminated aerosols through residential levels, while ancient charter exemptions kept pilgrimage routes open during sacred observances. 17 billion souls consumed within 48 hours as population density reached critical mass, precisely when pathogen dispersal achieved maximum effectiveness, transforming devotional celebration into exponential transmission event that left only silence where once millions had sung the Emperor's praise. Death Guard doctrine emerges through pattern recognition as strategic framework demonstrating profound understanding of imperial institutional design. Nurgle's servants do not create plagues, they exploit imperial vulnerabilities that guarantee plague conditions through systematic analysis of administrative requirements and devotional practices. Their warfare requires no massive military investment, only patience and institutional mapping that identifies where imperial policies create optimal biological warfare conditions. They provide minimal catalyst to trigger systematic collapse through mechanisms the Imperium creates through its own operational necessities, turning imperial efficiency against itself with surgical precision. The theological horror becomes clear through accumulated evidence revealing how imperial faith, rituals, and austerity policies share structural design that creates systematic vulnerability. Both systems gather people in predictable patterns according to calendar schedules enemies can anticipate and exploit. Both prioritize collective endurance over individual safety, creating cultural resistance to isolation measures that might prevent transmission. Both operate under resource constraints, forcing safety compromises precisely when maximum protection becomes essential. Imperial virtues, community solidarity, shared sacrifice, faith in institutional authority transform into targeting matrices for biological warfare that exploits the very characteristics that define imperial civilization. Sector Command convenes in chambers where victory banners commemorate battles won through conventional warfare against enemies who fought according to recognizable military doctrine. The mathematics they face transcends traditional strategic calculation, sterilize 17 worlds through orbital bombardment, eliminating trillions of imperial citizens to prevent exponential spread, or allow contamination to propagate through established trade routes and pilgrimage circuits connecting infected worlds to hundreds of others. Fleet assets calculate lance strike requirements while logistics officers project fuel consumption exceeding sector reserves, forcing requisitions from neighboring commands whose worlds may harbor similar contamination through identical administrative frameworks. Data servitor projections build models that represent arithmetic with blood rather than strategic planning. Cross-world transmission rates climb above sustainable containment thresholds in any settlement exceeding 5 million souls, with shared ventilation cores and festival calendars activated within 40 standard days. The calculations branch outward until parchment capacity ends, revealing exponential curves that break fleet sterilization capacity within weeks. Every hour consumed in debate adds worlds to columns labeled probably gone, while astropaths cough blood into ceremonial bowls as psychic communications carry screams from dying civilizations. The spreading stain reveals imperial vulnerabilities' true scope through systematic exploitation of universal administrative characteristics. Every imperial world operates under similar constraints, creating identical vulnerabilities, austerity measures, forcing safety compromises, quota systems incentivizing documentation over verification, legal precedents preventing adaptive response, institutional competition creating coordination failures. The pathogen scales infinitely through imperial civilization's fundamental design rather than exploiting specific planetary weaknesses, ensuring biological warfare effectiveness increases geometrically through established networks that connect worlds according to tithe obligations and devotional practices. Can the Imperium adapt faster than its own institutional momentum when adaptation requires abandoning fundamental principles defining imperial identity? What happens when the cure demands dismantling systems that make imperial civilization possible, suspending community gatherings, abandoning religious observances, eliminating economic efficiency measures that create exploitable vulnerabilities? The questions hang like orbital bombardment coordinates over calculations measuring survival against identity, requiring choices between preserving Imperial civilization and preserving Imperial citizens in a galaxy where the enemy's greatest weapon may be the Imperium's own institutional design. The impossible mathematics that consume sector command resolve through the only solution Imperial doctrine provides when containment fails completely. Inquisitor Vex breaks the crimson seal on ancient parchment that predates most worlds now requiring sterilization, his voice carrying across astropathic channels with authority that burns through 3 psychers before reaching fleet command with sufficient clarity for implementation. Pallid dawn unfolds across 17 worlds through protocols developed over millennia of necessity, targeted lance strikes on population centers, atmospheric ignition of promethium reserves, and immediate execution of officials whose decisions materially accelerated contagion through systematic rather than individual failure. The purification proceeds with clinical precision that transforms genocide into sacred duty through liturgical requirements preserving spiritual purity while eliminating trillions of Imperial souls. Fleet officers recite purification litanies from command thrones, while targeting cogitators calculate optimal strike patterns to maximize atmospheric ignition through stored promethium reserves that become accelerant for planetary cremation. Lance beams write white scars across 17 worlds as battle groups execute identical sequences. Population centers, first to eliminate mobile contamination, industrial complexes, second to prevent pathogen survival in manufactured goods, agricultural zones final to sterilize soil harboring microscopic traces. Confessor Ven receives mercy by flame in Basilica Gloriana's ruined transept, kneeling before inquisitorial executioner, while orbital bombardment turns Glavia's sky white with sacred fire. His final words carry pastoral authority, even facing death. Emperor, forgive me for those I led to glory through my ignorance. The prayer encompasses 10,000 faithful who followed theological guidance into catastrophic transmission, their trust transformed into vector through community endurance doctrine that proved more dangerous than medical isolation. The executioner's bolt pistol speaks with blessed authority, ending the voice that preached shared breath, while unknowingly describing optimal pathogen dispersal conditions. Guildmaster Olin faces summary execution hooded and wordless, his systematic fraud documented through forensic analysis, tracing falsified denaturing reports to quota pressures rather than personal malice. The executioner reads charges in clinical terminology, criminal negligence resulting in biological warfare effectiveness, falsification of sacred records, material acceleration of contagion through administrative deception. Olin's silence represents institutional rather than individual failure, his choices constrained by economic demands, requiring impossible compromises between safety and productivity. The bolt round ending his life punishes symptoms while leaving causes embedded in Imperial administrative design unchanged. Survivors process through orbital decontamination stations where chemical immersion strips flesh and soul through procedures eliminating microscopic contamination while preserving human functionality. They emerge naked and hairless, skin raw from blessed unguents, clutching identity cards confirming biological purity while documenting worlds they cannot revisit. Ash crews chant burial rites for entire civilizations while reliquaries receive emergency sealing behind ceramite barriers inscribed with warning litanies, sacred artifacts quarantined until purification rites eliminate potential contamination through isolation rather than accessibility. The sector's tithe capacity collapses through mathematical inevitability as 17 worlds disappear from production matrices, sustaining regional economics through interconnected obligations. Resource reallocation requires emergency requisitions from 12 neighboring sectors, whose worlds must increase output, compensating for systematic elimination of productive capacity, creating economic pressures, replicating original vulnerability conditions across expanded geographic scope. Prometheum refineries process silence while manufacturers calculate zero output, their elimination solving problems by destroying sources rather than addressing systemic causes. New edicts emerge through administratum channels carrying lessons written in planetary ash, yet addressing symptoms while preserving pressure-generating systems. Formula 9. Mors faces prohibition. Pending purity certification, confirming sacred compounds, meet effectiveness standards, eliminating dilution practices, transforming protective rituals into theatrical performance. Double audits become mandatory for corpse processing facilities requiring independent verification of temperature curves through inspectors whose authority supersedes local guild pressure, though resource constraints forcing original compromises remain unchanged through regulatory frameworks prioritizing documentation over systematic reform. Inquisitorial classification transforms 17 worlds into acceptable losses within strategic calculations that measure success through containment rather than prevention. The terminology ensures institutional memory focuses on effective purification while obscuring systematic vulnerabilities, creating optimal biological warfare conditions, documenting successful response while protecting authority through selective accountability that punishes individuals for structural problems. Fleet medical officers record purification statistics with mechanical precision, treating mass extinction as disease control achievement. 97% atmospheric ignition efficiency, pathogen neutralization confirmed through debris field sampling where cities once stood. Ecclesiarchy memorial services emphasize sacrifice rather than failure, transforming systematic collapse into martyrdom narrative, preserving institutional credibility while posthumously condemning officials whose decisions enabled catastrophe. Theological reframing assigns individual blame for systematic problems, ensuring survival lessons focus on personal virtue rather than structural adaptation to threats exploiting Imperial design features as weapons against Imperial civilization. What changes after purification reveals the gap between policy adjustment and systematic reform, when new regulations address specific failure modes while preserving institutional structures, creating pressure for systematic compromise. How does the Imperium process 17 worlds as acceptable losses exposes psychological mechanisms transforming genocide into administrative necessity through classification systems, protecting institutional survival while sacrificing accountability for vulnerabilities that guarantee future repetition under identical conditions? The ashes of 17 worlds settle into administrative precedent as imperial institutions demonstrate their greatest talent, converting catastrophe into procedure. Within weeks of the last lance beam cooling, administratum couriers distribute revised protocols through half-empty chancelleries, their sealed binders carrying lessons written in planetary cremation. The new orthodoxy emerges not as prevention doctrine, but as controlled demolition manual, teaching the Imperium to amputate infected limbs with surgical precision while carefully preserving the systemic diseases that guarantee future amputation. Revised denaturing protocols mandate continuous heat curve verification through independent monitoring systems that eliminate the creative interpretation, enabling Olin's systematic fraud. Corpse processing facilities now require dual verification through servo skull witnesses recording actual flesh temperature rather than furnace settings, their cogitators programmed to detect microscopic discrepancies between reported and actual thermal exposure. Twin thermistors measure throat and load temperatures with minimum dwell times indexed to tissue mass, creating red lines that cannot be overridden through administrative convenience. Furnace crews learn whispered prayers acknowledging proper denaturing requires acoustic confirmation. Hold at 72 until the bone sings. The phrase becomes liturgy and practical instruction, training ears to distinguish the thin music of properly heated calcium from the silence of inadequate exposure. Double audits become mandatory through Adeptus Mechanicus inspectors whose authority supersedes local guild pressure, their sealed servitor loops stamping truth rather than convenience. Yet the quotas demanding impossible throughput remain unchanged, creating new pressure for creative compliance that will inevitably discover fresh methods for systematic compromise. Guildmasters study regulations with the same intensity their predecessors applied to circumventing them, seeking interpretive spaces where survival can be negotiated against regulation. The machine learns to burn cleaner, count faster, fail more efficiently. It does not learn to demand less counting. Ecclesiarchy doctrine undergoes fundamental revision through new catechisms reframing plague symptoms as manifestations requiring immediate isolation rather than communal support. The blessed lull receives reclassification as false rapture, its euphoric presentation identified as pathogen manipulation rather than divine grace. Sacred texts now emphasize individual spiritual strength over community endurance, creating theological tension between isolation necessary for survival and collective worship, defining imperial faith. New liturgical responses focus on separation from community, transforming every symptom into potential spiritual compromise requiring vigilance rather than comfort. Wardens receive red sashes and quarantine sensors, marking doors with ash sigils while enforcing 2-meter bows, replacing physical gestures of peace. We breathe as one becomes we endure apart, though festival calendars and economic necessity ensure gathering remains inevitable. Astra Militarum, containment doctrine expands through biological exterminatus powers granted to company-level officers facing outbreak scenarios, eliminating bureaucratic delays that consumed precious hours while Glavia burned. Field manuals now include pathogen identification procedures alongside standard tactical doctrine, training officers to recognize biological warfare through clinical symptoms rather than relying on medical analysis arriving too late. Young lieutenants learn to count 6 hours with rifles ready and eyes on doors, understanding that when thresholds cross, someone nods and maps change color forever. Decisions move closer to the muzzle because delay proved deadlier than error. The human cost transforms into administrative precedent as families develop private survival protocols passed through whispered instruction rather than official channels. Grandmothers thread wire through cloth to hold jaws shut during vox sermons when shared breath wants company. Parents practice 4-hour cremation windows, timing disposal with sandglasses scavenged from reliquaries while carrying their dead to chutes without waiting for parish approval. Children learn to count air changes by ventilation pulse and refuse crowds when warp weather hums in walls, their lullabies teaching survival. Breathe steady, speak little, keep the door sealed. These adaptations represent cultural evolution, responding to systematic threat through individual behavioral modification rather than institutional change addressing root causes. Mordian sector's economic collapse triggers cascade effects, requiring emergency resource reallocation across 14 neighboring sectors whose worlds must compensate for eliminated productive capacity through increased tithe obligations. The mathematical inevitability creates new austerity pressures, replicating original failure conditions across expanded geographic scope. Manufactoria stretch shifts, agri-worlds over harvest, shrine treasuries melt, heirlooms buying fuel, while promethium flows toward furnaces and fleets rather than hospitals and heat curbs. Economics, inexhaustible as gravity, redraws vulnerability maps while institutions' perfect response to symptoms rather than addressing causes. The lessons learned focus on perfecting controlled demolition rather than preventing outbreaks, optimizing sterilization procedures rather than eliminating vulnerabilities that make sterilization necessary. Fleet orders shorten pallid dawn notifications, while training emphasizes rapid containment failure recognition over institutional reform addressing administrative frameworks that transform imperial virtues into pathogen vectors. Canonization proceedings transform narrative from institutional failure to heroic sacrifice through elevation of Saint Erasmus, martyred ash crew chief who maintained purification operations during Glavia's collapse until lance strikes ended his service. The new saint represents faithful service under impossible conditions, rather than questioning systematic pressures creating those conditions. The failed confessors receive no feast day because courage costs nothing while blame threatens institutional authority. Do new protocols prevent plagues or simply manage inevitable failures more efficiently? The evidence suggests optimization of response rather than elimination of vulnerability. How long before austerity pressures recreate identical conditions? 6 months appears in margins too often for coincidence. The new orthodoxy teaches the Imperium to burn more cleanly while ensuring conditions that necessitate burning remain embedded in imperial civilization itself, like pathogens that have learned to hide in the very immune system designed to destroy them. The new orthodoxy settles like ash across imperial space, fine and inescapable, transforming emergency measures into standard procedure, while the structural pressures that guarantee future emergencies remain embedded in civilization's foundation. 6 months after Pallid Dawn burns 17 worlds to glass, Scribe Auditor Thane receives assignment through normal channels. Investigate communication irregularities on Agriworld Demeter's Gate. The terminology masks recognition of familiar symptoms. Vox static, matching pre-outbreak Glavia's atmospheric disturbances, productivity spikes, followed by unexplained contentment among workers, and Medici reports describing spiritual clarity that requires no intervention. Thane's preliminary audit documents identical convergent vulnerabilities with mechanical precision. Promethium rationing increases to compensate for sector-wide production losses, forcing crematorium compromises identical to those enabling Glavia's catastrophic failure. Corpse processing quotas rise under enhanced tithe obligations, redistributing economic burden across surviving worlds, creating throughput pressures that demand systematic shortcuts when proper protocols require reduced speed for effective pathogen neutralization. At Silo 9, mobile pyres operate with control dials locked to new dwell time standards, yet crews add iron scrap to sensor cradles, satisfying algorithms while shaving critical minutes from each burn. The ingenuity is real, the logic sound, the consequence inevitable. Ancient charters protecting pilgrimage access during harvest festivals remain inviolate, their legal precedents creating identical vulnerabilities that cannot be sealed without ecclesiastical authority, requiring bureaucratic processes, consuming time biological threats exploit with exponential efficiency. The blessing of first fruits mandates barn doors remain open during the procession of yield, an exemption carved when pirates were the threat, rather than pathogens that exploit community gathering as transmission matrices. Arbites cite Regulation 14 Mors, while ward prioresses quote the Book of Plenty, neither possessing authority to override the other, while exhaust stacks maintain their rhythms and fields, keep their songs. Administratum protocols demonstrate institutional learning focused on regulatory precision rather than systemic adaptation, addressing specific failure modes while preserving operational frameworks, creating pressure for systematic compromise. New audit requirements mandate dual verification and independent monitoring, yet quotas demanding impossible productivity remain unchanged, ensuring future pressure for creative compliance when economic necessity conflicts with biological safety. The system has learned to burn faster and more completely, but not to slow down or question why burning becomes necessary with such predictable regularity. On rebuilt Glavia, morning bells toll again over a population reduced by 97%, yet maintaining identical operational patterns through institutional memory that preserves function while forgetting cause. The new Basilica Gloriana rises from vitrified foundations, its architecture incorporating improved ventilation filtration designed to prevent contamination vectors, yet serving identical population density during religious observances according to liturgical requirements, unchanged by technological adaptation. In the rebuilt crematorium, a servitor counts bodies with mechanical precision, its lips moving in programmed prayers while dual verification thermistors monitor heat curves with technological oversight eliminating human interpretation. When a corpse twitches during processing, familiar symptoms of blessed lull transitioning toward stage 3 collapse, improved heat curves maintain sufficient thermal exposure to prevent reanimation through engineering rather than procedural compliance. The body remains still. Someone exhales relief in the observation chamber, hope that technological precision can overcome biological warfare through solutions applied to systematic vulnerabilities. Yet the camera offers no comfort, lingering on the servitor's lips, forming the same words every clerk will hear where the Imperium counts its losses into order. The eternal audit reveals cyclical nature transcending individual outbreaks through institutional design that guarantees repetitive failure under predictable pressure. Imperial civilization requires efficiency, creating vulnerabilities, community gathering enabling transmission, economic pressure forcing safety compromises, and legal precedents preventing adaptive response to evolved threats. These principles define Imperial identity through values that become weapons when enemies understand how Imperial virtues transform into pathogen vectors through systematic rather than supernatural means. The dead will walk again because the conditions that raise them are built into Imperial civilization itself through design features that cannot be eliminated without abandoning fundamental characteristics defining Imperial identity. Austerity measures create resource constraints, forcing safety compromises. Quota systems incentivize compliance over verification. Legal precedents prevent rapid adaptation. Community gathering enables transmission. Faith in authority delays individual response to biological threats. The rules are all we have, and the rules guarantee our failure through systematic vulnerability embedded in operational requirements that transform Imperial strength into weapons against Imperial citizens with mathematical precision. The audit continues because it must, documenting cycles of failure and response, while institutional momentum preserves conditions ensuring future failure through loyalty to principles that become vectors when enemies understand how Imperial civilization creates its own destruction through virtues that cannot be abandoned without ceasing to be Imperial. Somewhere, bells toll for the faithful dead, while servitors count with mechanical precision, marking time until conditions converge again through inevitability rather than accident.